look like we've got a good crew on, so we'll go ahead and get started with today's webinar. Thank you guys for joining us. I know, Courtney, you were going to go over some of the control panels and the basic information for folks.
Hi there. This is Courtney McSwain. I am the communications strategist for NJJN, and just wanted to go over a few of the housekeeping things. Just to let everyone know, your audio is muted because we do have so many people on today, and so we'll just want to keep down the background noise. And I'm sure you are already familiar, but on your screen in the upper right-hand corner is the control panel, and you can minimize that by clicking the orange arrow button to make it go down, and then you can expand it again by clicking that same arrow to bring it back to the full size. As you have questions during the webinar, if you want to go ahead and type those into the questions box, we'll be monitoring those and taking a look at them throughout the conversation, and then towards the end during Q&A, we'll be able to see those questions. If we do have too many questions throughout the presentation, our panelists have agreed to take some of those via email. So we'll hopefully have a chance to address those if we don't get to them here during the conversation. And lastly, this is being recorded, so you will all get the recording after the webinar, and we'll also make it available on our website. So if you know anyone who didn't get a chance to sit in today, they can get that recording as well. So I think that should be it.
Great, thanks, Courtney. So welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us for the pre-booking diversion, why it's needed and how to increase race equity. I'm Allison Clemens with the National Juvenile Justice Network, and we're super excited to have these awesome panelists with us today. So we have Purewal Bopari with Human Impact Partners, Kent Mendoza with the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, and Kim McGill with the Youth Justice Coalition. And before I turn it over to them, I just wanted to give a little bit of background for folks on who we are and why we're interested in diversion. So at the National Juvenile Justice Network, we have members all across the country. So we have 54 state-based advocacy organizations and lots of individuals all across the US and 44 states and DC. And everyone's working to shrink the youth justice system and make sure that the remainder is really treating youth and families with dignity and humanity. And we try to do all that through an anti-racist lens. And so each year we do a policy platform, and this year our membership voted to focus on diversion and diversion programs. And so in doing that, we talked with young people all across the country who talked about really the need to address the whole child and make sure that, you know, their basic needs are being met, that they're able to get to school, that they're getting food, that their families are supported, and really talking about that as a way to reduce youth incarceration and really just reduce crime altogether. And the best way to do that, as we know, is to make sure that young people aren't being arrested and put into the youth justice system. And so we looked for diversion programs and diversion policies all across the nation, and we'll be putting that report out later this year. And as we're doing that, we really saw that California had done incredible work to change from a probation model to one that really focuses on youth development, and is that really structuring and fronting diversion rather than arrest and incarceration. And so we wanted to have our awesome presenters talk about how they got there, why it's important, and really how to do it in an equitable way. So we'll start with Kent, and he'll talk with us more about why diversion is important. So Kent, are you able to share your screen? And I'll make sure I change presenter to you. So you should be seeing your screen.
You see it?
I see the pre-booking diversion, NJJN's logo, but not the material you were hoping to share.
Oh, I don't have material.
Oh, well, I can share my screen if you want.
Okay. Hello?
Yep, we can hear you.
Sorry, but because I'm having issues with this. Oh, there.
No worries. Let's see. I think there we go. We can see you. Sorry about that.
Yes. Sorry about that. What was the question? I didn't hear. Um,
I think everyone can see you, and I know that you're going to talk with us a little bit why, why diversion is important and a little bit about your work. So if you want to kick us off.
okay. Well, thank you for having me here today. It's an honor to be able to, be in a webinar talking to amazing people and about an important topic to me personally and to my organization and to the people that are working on this issue, at least in LA County. So I guess that I'll start off by, I want to show a picture. Just so you guys, I'm gonna start with this picture. I want everybody to see this. Can everybody see this?
Yep, we can see it.
So the reason I want to show this picture is because I want to show you guys, this is me when I was 17 years of age. And this is my one of my best friends who I known since we were children. And this is when both of us were in the juvenile probation facility in LA County when both of us were being tried as adults. We were both being tried as adults. We're both facing 25 to life for something that we did when we were 15 and 16 years of age. And then years later, this is us outside in the free world. And the reason I wanted to show this because this is why youth diversion is important. Youth diversion is important because if there would have been some type of system that that provided uh, services that really address the issues of youth who are in gangs or dealing with drug issues or just simply have are dealing with circumstances in their communities that sometimes and often that leads to them doing these things like joining gangs or being poor can lead to a lot of things. Growing up in a community where there's no real resources, there's no real quality education, there's no real help, kind of pushes kids towards this path. And unfortunately for me, there was never no system that really helped me rehabilitate myself. When I first was incarcerated, I was 15 years of age. And, during the age 15 to 17, which is the time that I was incarcerated in a probation juvenile camp, I never ever like came with this idea that I wanted to change or that I had a potential to do good in life. This whole system of probation that was meant to be there to help the kids was actually destroying people, destroying the kids and creating traumas. So because I was in this facility for 18 months from the age 15 to 17 and got out at the age of 17 without no real resources, without no real support from the probation department that was supposed to be there to do the work that community-based organizations are currently doing around youth diversion and helping youth re-enter the communities, it kind of made it more difficult for me to re-enter my community. So when I was released at the age of 17, without no real model out there for me to help me and address my issues as a kid that is developing and growing up, I ended up getting locked up the same month of getting out, and then ended up facing 25 to life at age 17. So what I'm trying to say is that youth diversion is important that we have in all the counties in all the states and in the country overall, because if we don't provide a real system that can really address the issues that kids really can really work on, we're going to continue having a system of punitive approaches to the kids. And currently in LA County, we are in a moment where Kim might talk more about the history, but we're in a moment where we are now moving towards moving kids away from the probation department. So if you guys don't know, the probation department is the biggest probation department in the entire country. It's over $1 billion budget, and most of its money goes to salaries and benefits. And probation has been there for years, for decades, serving thousands of kids in LA County. And unfortunately, it has been failing all these thousands of kids, including myself and many others, by not really addressing their potential. Because at the end of the day, it's about what the kid can offer. How much potential does a kid have? And I feel like for so long, this punitive model of the probation system and the criminal justice system and the juvenile justice system has been more focused on how the kids behave and their treatment and their mental health, but they don't really explore their development and how much potential they have. When I was locked up, growing up, and I'm gonna say this real quickly. I don't want to take too much time, but growing up, before joining gangs, before going into that lifestyle, there were things that I wanted to do as a kid. But because of my circumstances, because of how I was growing up, because of the community I was growing up in, because how poorly funded my community was, and how poorly there were no real resources for youth or youth centers or anything like that for me growing up. You know, I wasn't able to pursue those things as a kid, you know, and some of the things is like I wanted to be when I was growing up as a kid, I wanted to join the army. I used to fantasize of being in the army. Unfortunately, that was not something I could pursue because of the resources that I didn't have as a kid. Another thing that I wanted to be an artist. I wanted to draw. I wanted to, you know, become a famous artist as a kid. I remember drawing as a kid growing up. Unfortunately, like I said, because of circumstances in the system, that was not something I could pursue. Another thing that I wanted to be, I wanted to join the army, you know, I wanted to join the Marines, you know, I wanted to be in the military as a kid. And these are things that I used to fantasize about and think of when I was a kid growing up. But once I hit a certain age and joined a gang and started entering the system, started getting in touch with law enforcement, all those dreams and these fantasies were no longer there. You know, the system came to my life when I was 13 years of age. And at the age of 13, all the way till I was 22, I was on probation. So for many years, I was being invested. Yes, the probation was invested in me, but they were not invested in my development, in my potential. They were invested in how to make me a worse individual, and that is by putting me in a probation camp. Uh, you know, where I experienced being pepper sprayed, where I experienced being in solitary confinement, where I experienced the most dehumanizing experience in my life, and you know where versus a youth development system that's supposed to, you know, I feel the probation is supposed to have done this for many years, but now they're in they failed, you know, and now it's time where we're in a time where in LA County we are moving towards moving kids away from the probation department and placing them into a department that focuses on their development and it's not about treatment and their potential. Because like I said, for many years the probation department has been dealing with this population, and yet they're failing kids. You know, a lot of kids are doing prison sentences because nothing was addressed when they were 15, 16, and 17. And I speak that on behalf of many of my members. You know, one of my interns that I just hired an intern who got out, who spent 9 years in the system. He was incarcerated when he was 12 years old when he was incarcerated. From camp, they sent him to the Department of Juvenile Justice. From there, he went to prison. He was in from the age 12 all the way to 21. He's just recently been out for 30 days, and I just hired him as my intern. So, like, to me, when I see stories like him, you know, that was locked up at the age of 12, and he didn't get out until he was 21, this is why we need a youth diversion model. This is why it's critical that we not only create a youth diversion model, but create a model that is actually reflecting what the kids really want. And it's also being run and operated by the people that mostly understand the issues that these kids are dealing with. And that's people that are working in the community. So that's why we need a real youth diversion model. So we don't have more people that have to go through this. So we don't have kids that get locked up at the age of 15, be sent to prison and get out when they're 30. And like I said, in my organization at the Anti-Recidivism Coalition, we have many ARC members who are all formerly incarcerated, who are beyond system impacted. They all serve years in prison, and a lot of them, unfortunately, they all started when they were 14, 15, and 16. And because in those days, the laws were more different than how they are now, and the way we used to look at kids were more, you know, super predator, all these things, you know, it unfortunately led to many doing many years in prison. But now, like I said, thankfully, you know, we're in a moment where we're finally moving away from that in LA County at least. And like I said, it's important that we create this all across the states and the country, because you know it's all about kids. This whatever we create now is not gonna affect me. It's gonna affect the next generation, the next kids that are coming, that are going through high school, middle school right now. So it's important that we create a model, because like I said, I don't want nobody ever have to go through this. I don't want nobody have to experience the most dehumanizing experiences in jail. And I think that LA County is one of those counties that, even though we're doing a lot of great things, we also are one of those counties that has the most baddest systems. You know, we have the largest probation department, we have the largest sheriff department. But yeah, we need a holistic model that really addresses the issues of these kids, because like I said, I feel that we can divert many kids instead of sending them to jail. I think every kid, nobody's born to be bad. Nobody's born and says I'm gonna be a criminal. There are things that happen in their life that lead them to making decisions that ultimately put them in that system. And I think it's time that we look at kids as kids and really address their needs as something that's more of like their potential, because everybody has potential and we need to provide them a system that can help them bring all that potential out. So what I would envision for a youth diversion model and system all across, is like, just imagine we had a big community center, like a big center that is being invested with millions of dollars, and in this center you have a studio of music, you have a studio of art, you have teachers, you have I don't know, all those things, because at the end of the day, when I look at youth diversion and development, I look at an opportunity for the youth to excel to the fullest in their potential in any way possible. And I think that we don't have that in place. And I think it's time that we have that, and we are moving towards that in LA County at least. So I think that's something that I'll share. I don't know if I'm taking too much time. I feel like I am.
I appreciate you sharing all that, Kent. And I think that your story and the passion that you shared really echoes what we heard from young people all across the country, and is why we're super excited for this webinar, and honestly really grateful for the work that you and ARC has been doing. And I know Kim's been working on this too in LA County, so I want to allow her to share a little bit of how folks have been doing the work and where it started. So I think we have your slides up, Kim, if you're able to chime in.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. And also want to lift up that there's groups all over the nation and the world that have been huge inspirations to us fighting similar campaigns and making huge progress. Wanted to talk a little bit about how we won diversion in LA County, as well as other changes that led up to it, because there's a lot of I would say steps toward diversion. The most recent change is part of a larger movement that's been significant. And this is just reflecting on YJC or the other groups we're in coalition with's work. But I also want to lift up that there's, again, groups throughout the state of California and throughout the nation that are doing other similar work. This first slide is YJC members on a 50-mile march. We've done them we did them for about 10 or 12 years in a row, from Sylmar Juvenile Hall to our state youth prison on the other side of the county. And as part of that, young people surveyed residents all across the county, from the wealthiest areas to areas that were more low income, that were heavily policed, that were really impacted by incarceration. And as Kent said, Youth Justice Coalition, similarly, all of us here have been through the system, either detained, incarcerated, some deported, as well as our immediate family members. But we wanted to talk to residents beyond us to see what their vision was. So our work on diversion and on transformation of juvenile injustice more generally comes from the streets and what residents told us they wanted, what young people told us they wanted. We also looked a lot at history. We wanted to find out why LA County led the world in incarceration. As Kent mentioned, we have the largest system in the world, and it is built off of the backs of young people of color. So we looked a lot at what was happening in other regions of the country, particularly East Coast and Midwest, with the development of youth development and the creation of the first juvenile court in Chicago. And then compared that, and I apologize because some of the words are missing on how it got translated in the email. But the heading here is what are the key components of youth development? And one of the things that we wanted to push early on was that while the East Coast and Midwest, while it wasn't perfect, got a youth development model that led to a transformation of how young people were treated in the system, LA County focused instead on massive criminalization of people of color, especially. So we were the only county west of Texas to side with the Confederacy. We had the highest lynching rate between 1848 and 1871. Law enforcement attacking communities of color and young people especially was part of our history from 1848 on, including one of the largest mass lynchings in US history, the Chinese Massacre in 1871. And all of this put us in a very different situation in terms of an addiction to incarceration and deportation. So we first started to really promote what is youth development and why we don't have it in our county, and to put out a different vision, which includes focusing on all of those competencies for young people in the system, as well as young people who've never been contacted by courts or police. And again, I apologize that the slides came out different in terms of color and stuff, so it might be hard to read. But in addition to young people being criminalized here very differently from 1848 on, it led to us having a huge infrastructure for criminalization. So we now today have the world's largest juvenile halls, the largest county jail system, the largest probation department, the largest sheriff's department in the world. And LA County is also #1 nationally in deportation. That also means that our budgets are huge in terms of suppression. It was important for us also to lift up the more recent history and how LA County has exported these policies across the state, across the nation, and across the world. So of course, out of LA County comes Richard Nixon, the war on drugs, Ronald Reagan, the war on drugs on steroids, as well as globalization, which takes out any kind of union sector jobs, and then Iran-Contra, which floods communities of color with drugs and replaces a factory economy with union jobs, union wages, with a drug economy, underground economy, which greatly escalates violence in LA County. And while this happened surely across the country, it's been proven that it happened in LA County, the collusion between federal law enforcement and local law enforcement to flood neighborhoods with guns and drugs. And then also on the right is Howard Jarvis, and out of LA County came the anti-tax movement and tax revolt, white flight. And for us, that was also the Proposition 13 got passed statewide. Howard Jarvis wrote that initiative and promoted that initiative, which depleted other kinds of infrastructure in our communities, parks, playgrounds, youth centers, jobs programs, schools, most notably, because of an anti-tax movement in terms of property taxes, both for commercial and residential. And so again, I apologize that a lot of the text here is missing, but we focused on several different strategies. One is data, decriminalization, decarceration, diversion, and divestment, so that diversion couldn't really be seen for us as a standalone, but was coupled with these other incidents. And our goals from the start was to establish youth development departments for LA City and LA County, including promoting that youth development departments focus on youth jobs, youth centers, and intervention workers, replacing police in schools and such a heavy police presence in communities. Those were things that the community residents that I mentioned surveying really promoted. Free Metro passes for K through college, just 20% of what the Metro spends on subcontracts to law enforcement would give every single student in LA County a free Metro pass and give them access to the entire county. And then move youth up to age 25 and move youth entirely out of probation and end youth incarceration. So from the start, those were the goals that we really promoted. And I'll get out a revised PowerPoint to everyone who wants it. You could contact us and we could send it to you directly. And you could go to the next slide. So the other thing we had to do was document spending on youth law enforcement versus youth development. And you could keep going. And again, there's words missing here. But this is Gloria Galvez. She was one of the youth researchers. And one of the things that we did was interviewed over 2,000 residents across LA County on what they thought their priorities would be. You can go to the next slide. And we found also through our research, young people looked at all 57 law enforcement agencies in LA County. And we were able to prove that we had the highest police budgets in the nation, with over nearly $4 billion a year spent on law enforcement. And that was 2012 dollars. So it's even increased since now. That was when we dropped our first report, as well as over nearly 30,000 sworn officers and additional civilian personnel. And you can see in these next slides that we were also able to document how, even though there was a dramatic drop in youth crime and youth arrests, we had an increase in the probation department's budget. It's gone up nearly 500 million now since in the past 10 years, since 2006, 2007. An increase also in the next slide of the sheriff's department budget. Similarly, went up 1 billion at a time when we had record lows in terms of arrest and these historic drops in custody. And then you'd see similar changes in the LAPD's budget. You go to the next slide, we were able to put out some pretty startling data about what that meant in terms of the cost per year to lock a young person up. It's gotten up even further now, but by 2017, We were spending nearly $250,000 a year to incarcerate one young person in a local youth prison, a probation camp, and we had more probation camps than community colleges at that time, as well as nearly 300,000, about 281,000 each year in a juvenile hall. Now it's escalated because of further drops in the population without drops in the budget to spending of $300,000 a year for a single year in juvenile hall. And there's cost there for arrests. And this data was really important for us to put out because it highlighted for our boards of supervisors and other officials the inequities in how young people were treated, criminalized, versus how they were invested in the community. This is the infographic I mentioned on the spending for LAPD, which is our city police department. We have 88 different cities in LA County, but Los Angeles City is the biggest, versus the spending on youth development. And one of the things that was really impactful that young people really talked about a lot and got a lot of media attention and attention from elected officials was that LA City is spending $13 million more a year to protect stray dogs than it is to protect young people from violence. We also compared it to what was happening in other cities, and that's that comparison there to show that our city was way behind other major cities in terms of its youth development spending. So what does this mean in terms of successes? And again, there's language missing here, but one of the things that happened in 2014, 2017 was we first started to go after kind of the low-level offenses, particularly citations. We found that about 200,000 tickets a year were being given out to young people, largely for truancy and fare evasion. We were part of a coalition that attacked truancy at the city level, LA City, and then the Youth Justice Coalition pushed on Metro to decriminalize fare evasion, which was 10,000 tickets a year on fare evasion. And then we went to the state level and passed a law that decriminalized fare evasion statewide, Senate Bill 882. This was the beginning of like our diverting young people out of the system. Then we did another campaign starting in 2010 in LA County. We really challenged the huge fees that were being charged to families for the time that their child was in juvenile hall and camp. And pushed to end those juvenile fees, and then passed a law at the state level, Senate Bill 190, that ended juvenile system fees and fines statewide. And then in 2017 to 18, ended the prosecution of youth under age 12 statewide. So all these we kind of took like a step-by-step process to divert more and more young people out of the system through both diversion, but also decriminalization, changing the laws in terms of who could be touched. And then in 2016 to 2018, the county put together a kind of a work group to study the possibility of diversion. And when we first went to that meeting, it was overwhelmingly law enforcement, county players in the room. So our first effort was really just to bum rush the room. I don't know how else to say it. I think in those initial meetings, there was just a few community partners and no young people. We pushed first. We took a lot of YJC members to have young people in the room, and then push for other community partners to be included, or just to again rush the room without an invitation in some cases. And in the course of those year and a half, the community voice became stronger and stronger and was able to really influence the process. One of the things that young people pushed for was that originally it was just going to be a department or a program for youth diversion. And we pushed hard for it to be youth diversion and youth development. So it became LA County's first youth development department and major investment in youth development. And again, there's a lot of words missing here, but the other things we worked on was what was happening with funding. We have a statewide law here called the Juvenile Justice Crime Prevention Act, which since the early 2000, 2001, 2002, when it was enacted, has put about $100 million a year across the state into youth prevention and intervention, with the not the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law being that would go to community-based programs, prevention and intervention programs, community-based, owned and operated. But instead, law enforcement has taken the majority of that money. And so one of the things we pushed hard on was making sure that our county was in compliance with state law, which had been out of compliance for 20 years. So the coalition that was created pushed hard for there to be community representation on that juvenile justice coordinating committee at the local level. Kent, who you just heard from, is one of the representatives now from the community. Gloria Gonzalez, a YJC member, another youth voice on that committee, and several other coalition members that all of us have been working on the coalition to build. And so we were able to transfer money away from probation, about 12 million now going to the community that was previously going either to probation or to other law enforcement partners. The other thing that was happening, and it was really key for us also to the CEO's office for our county did an audit of what was happening with probation money. I really encourage people to do audits. We're also going to do a state audit this year that we pushed for of how the spending Juvenile Justice Crime Prevention Act money is being spent across the state. And those audits have been really, really helpful to unearth what was really going on with money. But one of the things that original audit showed was that LA County was engaging in this practice called voluntary probation. We had as many as 21,000 youth that just during the year of 2018 that were either on voluntary probation or also on low-level probation supervision. 81% of the young people on voluntary probation supervision, I put voluntary in quotes because it was pretty coercive, were for things like low grades and other academic issues. None of the young people on voluntary probation have been charged with a crime. So this is a way to get probation supervision, probation conditions without having ever been charged with a crime. And in other states, in other counties in the state, there was even more egregious behavior, drug testing, random searches. So in addition to ending it in LA County, ending voluntary probation in LA County, we co-sponsored a bill, AB 901, which is going through the legislature now. It'll be next year, we'll be trying to hopefully pass it, that would end that practice statewide and also would decriminalize truancy statewide. And so the most recent thing that was one, and there's a whole slide missing that shows how the diversion process works. I'll get these slides out to you. I'm not sure what happened with the PowerPoint, but the diversion process for LA County that we were able to win. And again, when I say we, I can also get out in the slideshow, you'll see the coalitions that we helped to build that really led the work, including the Youth Uprising Coalition, that Anti-Recidivism Coalition that Kent represents, Youth Justice Coalition, Arts for Incarcerated Youth Network, Children's Defense Fund, Urban Peace Institute, a number of other groups are part of. But one of the things that diversion effort will do is that as many as 11,000 youth a year will no longer be fingerprinted, booked, or have any criminal record. Even if they're taken to the front door of juvenile hall, the goal is to divert them as soon as possible. And so now we're working on implementation of that, including getting grants out to several community sites that are the diversion partners for their areas of the county. And finally, we're working hard on fighting for probation oversight with muscle. Kent mentioned that we have the largest probation department in the world, and that was part of our early stats too. And one of the things that's meant is that not only is our probation department huge, but they have also escalated their role as becoming more and more like law enforcement and less like social workers, although the original intent of probation in the 1840s, when first created by the first probation officer, John Augustus, was that it would be a community intervention in court to pull people back out into community, not a law enforcement escalation or expansion of law enforcement's touch on young people. But unfortunately, our probation department, like many across the country, has become more and more militarized, more and more police oriented, and treated young people and adults on probation more and more harshly. And so what we've also pushed for is strong probation oversight. We're about to establish the nation's first probation oversight commission, at least the first one we know of. And the four things that we're really pushing for there are subpoena power, real community engagement, independent investigations and inspections, including the ability through subpoena power to look at uses of force by probation, to look at conditions of confinement, to be able to walk into any facility unannounced and talk to any young person or staff people want to. And then to both create and review policy and budget for the department. So I'll leave it there, and thank you all so much again for everyone else's work and for the opportunity to talk to you.
Thanks, Kim. Yeah, and we'll try to get your slides up too during the Q&A, because it might just be a sort of Mac to PC issue, so I apologize for that as well, but thanks for running through it without half of your slides. So let's go ahead and pivot. I know Kim talked a lot about the work to create sort of a presumption of diversion in LA County, and Suk's been doing a lot of work with human impact partners on using an evaluation framework to make sure that all diversion is done from a perspective of racial equity. So she'll talk more about that. And if these slides don't come through too, we can switch to Courtney and make sure that all the content is there. So just flag that for me.
Sounds good. Hi everyone, my name is Suk. I work at Human Impact Partners and I'll be speaking about a project that we worked on with YDD last year. And that was to develop an evaluation framework to ensure that youth of color have access to the diversion model that they're implementing there. And so I'll start with some information about us, and then I'll get into background about the project. So Human Impact Partners is a national nonprofit organization. We're located in Oakland, California. We work to transform the policies people need to live healthy lives by increasing the consideration of health equity in decision making. And we do that through research, advocacy, and capacity building. Some of the issue areas that we work on include criminal justice, economic security, immigration, and housing. And I think there was a slide before this. There you go. So our criminal justice work falls under our health instead of punishment program. And so our vision is that all people are healthy and free in a society where we wield our collective resources to help and never to punish or hurt, where all people get the care and assistance they need to repair any harms they have caused, to heal any historical or ongoing pain, and grow in community together, where there is no need for prisons, jails, detention centers, or policing, and where all people can thrive. Great. So as I mentioned, our project, our work with YDD started last year. It was about this time that we started working together. And at that time, YDD was just beginning to pilot partnerships between law enforcement agencies and community diversion programs. And so their formal work was just really beginning. And at the same time, we were speaking to various stakeholders and advocates in Southern California, so including folks from ARC and Kim as well. And so what they indicated was that there was a need to ensure that that youth of color were not being left behind in this process. And so we pivoted and focused on developing an evaluation framework that would support Los Angeles County when they were ready to do evaluations, and also to focus exclusively on racial equity. And some of the research methods that we used included conducting in-depth interviews with youth who were in the programs, their caregivers, diversion program staff, and law enforcement. And the second part of the methods was that we conducted a literature review of programs nationally. So looking at systematic reviews, evaluation reports, etc. So the evaluation framework is drawn on experiences and stories from Los Angeles, but does draw upon data from around the country. And so we do believe that there's lessons that can be learned from Los Angeles, even, especially up to this point. And it's the framework is really a tool for folks to pay close attention to how law enforcement and diversion programs might be intentionally or unintentionally limiting access for youth of color in their access to diversion programs, which we know are really important and beneficial. So in doing this work, we learned about 5 points of contact that youth have in their experience with first encounters with law enforcement and then progressing through diversion programs. And so we call these 5 points of contact touch points. And at each of these, we talk about how racial inequities are introduced, indicators of inequity, how to measure potential inequities. So for example, what data sources might be available. And we conclude each section with some promising practices. And so that's what I'm going to be focusing on today over the next few slides is the promising practices piece. I would encourage everyone to take a look at the full report. So it's linked here in the handouts tab. In addition to the report, we have a resource that's a table format of those of the touch points with the indicators, metrics, and etc. So in this first touch point, youth are stopped by a law enforcement officer. And so our question at this point is, what is leading to the disproportionate stops of Black and Brown youth? And so there are a number of practices that can be implemented. So one thing is putting an end to over-policing of Black and Brown communities by law enforcement. So that requires looking at policies, practices, cultural norms, attitudes, and biases within the field. It also includes looking at the laws to see what behaviors are being criminalized, but might be actually happening out of economic necessity. So Kim talked about fare evasion. That's one example. Looking at what sort of intervention is appropriate and not too excessive. And that's because youth, especially, they're still developing, they're learning, and they're bound to make mistakes. And the second part of this is that two settings, so schools and child welfare settings, which already have huge racial inequities there, they could be pipelines and sources of engaging with law enforcement. And so it's important to think about how to support staff there so that they can utilize more productive methods like restorative justice, trauma-informed approaches, and conflict resolution instead of an intervention that could be much more punitive. So in this next step, youth are referred by a law enforcement officer to a diversion program. And so the law enforcement officer typically makes this decision. And so some of the factors that we're thinking about here is what are the different things that are informing that decision. And so some agencies, some law enforcement agencies in Los Angeles do have eligibility criteria for youth as far as whether they are eligible to be referred. So having that to start in general is good to eliminate individual bias. But at the same time, it's important to look at those criteria to make sure that there aren't any underlying biases that are a result of systemic biases. In addition to looking at the criteria, it's also important to develop processes for review and accountability of decisions that law enforcement makes. And YDD is, and that's something that YDD does work on. They have a template. And then also to increase awareness and education for law enforcement about these programs. So what do they look like? What are the benefits? Increasing rapport and relationships between programs and officers. And then also training law enforcement on youth development on a more general level. So if and when youth are referred to a diversion program by a law enforcement officer, it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll get the opportunity to enroll. And so we found in the literature that between 10 and 25% of youth, even if they're eligible and referred, they don't actually enroll in the program. And so there can be a number of barriers that both youth and their families experience here. And some practices that both law enforcement and community diversion providers can implement include using effective communication practices. So that means, being very clear to youth and their families that what the programs are about. Again, that they're eligible in a very clear way, using, material that's in the preferred language of families and etc. And also when enrollment does happen, it should ideally happen in places and at times that are convenient for working families and for youth who are enrolled in school. And because this is, possibly the first interaction that youth have with these sorts of programs, and they do have a lot of potential, as Kent mentioned, it's important to take this time to invite youth and families in a way that's healing informed and to develop a plan that is individual, strengths-based, together in partnership with the youth and the family. So in this fourth step, this is probably the longest time that youth will engage in this entire process, and that's participating in and completing a diversion program. And so we did also find in the literature that youth of color have lower completion rates, and a lot of that is likely due to that these programs might not be convenient or culturally responsive. And so there are a number of ways to ensure that youth of color have access to these programs and can go on to fully complete them. And so that includes inviting caregivers to participate rather than requiring them, using program models that are restorative and not punitive, grounding programs in youth communities, hiring staff who are from community, but also skilled in engagement, knowing how to engage in doing things like motivational interviewing with families and youth, connecting youth to services that are not provided on site. And that's something that Kent had mentioned about really understanding the youth's interests and catering to that. Being flexible with care plans because youth needs and capacities can change over time, and maintaining long-term relationships so that, developing an exit strategy that's very cognizant of that. And finally, for youth who aren't able to complete the program, it's important to work with them directly and address any unique barriers they might be facing. So in this fifth step, so we don't in our conversations with advocates and folks who are involved with the different parts of the process, we learned that it's important to ensure that youth are thriving well after they leave a program. And so the ultimate goal is to prevent youth contact from the justice system, but also for them to develop and thrive. And so that requires, again, looking at some of the things we talked about in that first touch point about over policing, and it also requires investment in youth. So that includes the economic, educational, and social success through government programs, and especially through schools, which is clearly a place that youth engage a lot. It also includes addressing other systemic inequities through the social determinants of health. So things like ensuring that families and communities have access to good jobs and livable wages and good housing as well. Next slide. So at this point, YDD is looking for an external evaluator. As I mentioned, they're still piloting the partnership, so they have some a way to go. They are interested in process evaluation. However, some of the other things that they're working on in the meantime include building a data infrastructure. So that means getting access to data from law enforcement agencies and from the community diversion programs. And finally, they've also ensuring that youth data are protected against misuse. It's very important, a very high priority for YDD. And so some of the things they've done include they've worked with the UCLA Law School to develop data commitments and values to ensure protection of youth data. And then they're also looking towards developing a more permanent ad hoc oversight committee, which would include young people and people from the law school, to ensure that this is a permanent part of the program. And they've actually posted on their website the data values, which would be a good resource for folks to look at. So hopefully that was a lot of material. I'm sorry if I rushed through it, but it was, again, thanks so much for the opportunity to present here. We are really grateful for, the partnership and the input from everyone we spoke to as part of this project, especially the youth and their families for giving us their time and energy.
Thank you guys, and thanks everyone for talking us through what's happening. Know that we've gotten a few questions already through the questions platform, so I'm just trying to run through those to pose to folks. It looks like the first one is actually for you, Kim. If you could explain a little bit more about how voluntary probation worked, and we're just trying to get a sense of whether it exists in other areas.
I think it probably does exist. It for sure exists throughout California. What it was pretty much a secret, I would call it mission landslide of probation. As numbers dropped in terms of young people that were court referred or brought to the front door of juvenile hall and then diverted officially through our WIC code, Welfare and Institutions Code. We do have the ability of probation departments to divert young people who would otherwise be court involved. As those numbers began to drop significantly, and like the rest of the country, LA County and California had the most historic lows in arrests, both of youth and adults, since the 1950s and 60s. What started to happen without most people's knowledge was that our local probation departments across the state started to expand their role into prevention and intervention, quote unquote, working with young people who had no police contact in most cases, and for sure, no court involvement, had not been charged with any crimes. And so what probation was doing was using money that was coming from the state. Again, this intervention prevention money that was really intended, while not required, it was intended to go to community-based organizations to work with young people that were system involved or were on the verge of becoming system involved. Instead, they used the parts of the Welfare and Institutions Code that gave them authority to work with young people in prevention to greatly expand their role in that, and took that money to put probation officers in schools and in communities to really what we refer to in our report, and I can send you the report that a number of groups worked on. It was really a version of predictive policing. Probation talked about young people being either referred to them from schools, and again, referred is in quotes because there was a lot of coercion and pushing of students and their parents to get them into the program. They would put up flyers in some cases in the schools without really oftentimes saying that they were probation, so it looked like a prevention program run by the community, but it was in fact young people reporting to a probation officer. Again, I mentioned this earlier, but 81% of the young people for things like low grades and school attendance, and they were reporting to the same probation officers and oftentimes being treated very similarly to young people who were in that school or in that community on formal probation. So when we talk to our members, people that had been on formal probation, some for very serious charges, we're seeing young people that had no involvement in the court system coming to the same, probation bungalow or probation officer in the office in their schools. They were also pressured to follow the same conditions as young people on formal probation. So whether that was a curfew or checking in every day, or being threatened that if they didn't do better in school, they could be arrested or they could be put on formal probation, even though that was illegal to do so. They had no authority to do that. And in Riverside County, young people were also forced to drug test, to consent to random searches. So that's how it looked. We first worked with our local county chief. We have a chief that's in charge of juvenile probation and another deputy chief in charge of adult side. So we worked with Sheila Mitchell, who was the chief on the youth side, to end the practice in LA County. And it was a campaign, so it was a lot of mobilizing people to show up hearings. We issued that report that I mentioned. We did the work with the CEO's office to get the audit that I mentioned of how the spending was happening. And then the second part was this law that I mentioned, which we haven't passed yet, that would end it statewide. I hope that answers people's questions.
Yeah, thanks. And I apologize in advance to folks. We won't have time to get through all the questions. Kim, if you don't mind sending us the report, we'll be sure to share it with folks. I know that some of the people have been asking for copies. So
yes,
that'd be great to share. I think we have time for at least one more question. So a question came in around what can be done about discrimination against youth from multicultural families who may be headed by aged grandparents with disabilities by law enforcement who hold personal biases against these group demographics. And is there a step-by-step guide to get statewide legislative changes? So those are two big questions, but I wonder if folks are able to answer them.
Well, one thing I would say that in the presentation, and it was a really excellent presentation in terms of what diversion, how it's working in LA. The one thing I would change is that it sounded a little bit like the county players were really open to addressing discrimination and really open to protecting young people's data and privacy, as well as to make sure that diversion was including nearly all offenses, because that was also a struggle. And what I want to highlight is that it was over nearly 2 years of meetings, sometimes weekly, bi-weekly, work groups, sub-work groups, where the community really tried, did a lot of prep beforehand. We prepped young people, families, community organizations to be active in those meetings, and then to turn out week after week after week to push hard on all of those things, to raise the idea that young people's data should not be accessible to all law enforcement, let alone the district attorney's office, who are still at the table pushing for that kind of access, to set up policies and procedures to protect young people from criminalization in other ways, to make sure that the diversion data didn't become another database similar to the gang database that we've also worked to dismantle in California. So I really want to highlight that in your counties, which I know you already know this, strong diversion, strong decriminalization, decarceration will only happen if communities, especially people most impacted by these issues, are at the forefront of a strong movement. And it wouldn't have happened in our county had it been, as it was in the beginning, a largely law enforcement led initiative along with county officials. And the community wasn't always invited or welcomed at the table, although there were positions for community members from the start, mostly community-based organizations. But it's not something you're going to be invited in or welcomed in, or even at the end after the victory, be seen as a partner that's as essential as law enforcement. Because I think in our county, as in most counties, the fear is always going to be like, if we don't keep law enforcement at the table, we have no diversion. So.
Oh, thank you. We're at time too. So what I'll do is we'll make sure to make note of the questions that didn't get answered and try to get those to presenters to respond to. And we will get the updated PowerPoint from Kim and make sure we have the correct one, share that out, as well as the recording of the webinar. And if folks didn't get a chance to look, there are a number of handouts in the handout section of this webinar, which we have shared. And I know I did forget to mention that Kim and YJC also have a video done by their young people that talks about why diversion is important. And so we'll send out with the webinar recording as well, and make sure that that's available to folks, and we'll make sure to get you this report that Kim mentioned. So we're not going anywhere, and folks can feel free to direct questions to us, but we appreciate your time, and really again want to thank Ken, Suk, and Kim for their time today and for all their expertise.